how to do closed captions on Zoom. It'll show you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so let's give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. But all right. Can't figure it out, but I will. I'll look into it the moment when you get started. I'll try to figure out how to caption it, and it's going to say start typing, and I'm going to think to myself, no way. But Jesse, I will definitely look into it. All right, I think let's. By the way, Ori, I just muted you, so unmute yourself, and I think we are ready to get started. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you all for being here. And just as a reminder, we are streaming, which means it's being recorded. So please, okay, I'll look. Anyway, so I'm grateful to everyone being here. Also, thank you to those who sent in a little something to help defray the cost. I'm really grateful for that too. Okay, no, not much for introductions today. Here's as Johnny or as Ed McMahon once used to say, here's Ori. By the way, something very funny. And if anyone wants to never mind. I'll maybe I'll kind of be playful and figure it out myself. And then you'll understand what I did in a second. But in the meantime, Ori Feinberg, we're so grateful to have you back, and I'm going to look into how to caption. I see that Stephen sent me some info, so I'll figure it out from here. Ori, I'll let you.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi. It's always great to be back with all of you, and we're ready to go. I will say, as just from a full disclosure, my phone is right here. I have one in reserve duty, and actually another daughter who's getting on a plane as we speak to fly back to Israel, most likely to start reserve duty. So just in case, it's here. But other than that, we can get started. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. And just as an aside, of course, as we still have today's session and then next session after this, still within that framework of up until October 7th, as we get closer, we have a week or so. So a week from now, we'll be starting with the war itself. Obviously, you've been following along, but the more you are in tune with the sequence of events that are unfolding, even as we speak, I think it'll be helpful for you, at least with the amount of questions or the kind of questions you might be coming with. And we'll do our best to also be able to leave time for questions as well beyond the scope of the presentation. And there is a lot going on, but I'm not gonna get into that now because that would derail us from what we want to try and do. Okay. So trying to figure out what to call this next segment of ours, we went with peaks and valleys, pride and prejudice. And this idea of recognizing, now that we're full on, 70s are behind us, we're now through the 80s, although not completely done. And you may remember we ended last time with a major peak. I mean, really, one of the reasons the State of Israel was founded, not the only reason, but one of the reasons was to be a safe haven for the Jewish people. And sadly, we know that we seem to have a stopwatch any place that we've been in throughout history, any country we've ever been, no matter how good we thought we had it, there was a stopwatch that was started. That's not a fatalistic perspective, it's a historic perspective. And therefore, with the founding of the State of Israel, which served several purposes, as one would have been the reestablishment of a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, one that connected between an age-old existence in the land, an expulsion from the land, a continued yearning to return to the land. That's what the State of Israel did. Another reason for Zionism, and through that, the establishment of the State of Israel, was to create a reality in which there would not be pogroms and organized attacks against Jews without a Jewish ability to respond. 3 was to create a safe haven for the Jewish people who wish to come to Israel. So either for the pull factor, that is this age-old dream to return to our land, or a push factor, when you felt there was no other choice but to come here. So we ended with that, with the wave of immigration of Jews from Ethiopia. But that was in 1984, and therefore we're only midway through the 1980s. And we're going to find as we enter into the 1980s, 90s, and we make our way as far into the 2000s as we can get today, that, okay, we are secure as a modern state. We are secure with our ability to take care of ourselves. And now it's almost as if this is a realpolitik on the ground. How do we deal with all of that as we emerge out of the 70s, out of a socialist Israel, a poor Israel, a labor-oriented government Israel, and we move into a new reality in which we have a new kind of government that started at the end of the 70s, that is the Begin government, that is the Likud government, that is the center-right government, with its own ideology that perhaps in some places overlapped with the Labor Party, but in many ways diverged. It diverged through its understanding of Jewish existence in the area of the West Bank, although, let's be very clear, the first government to allow for and even encourage those settlements in the area of the West Bank was a labor government. So this question of left, right, we see that also fluctuates, which, by the way, if you remember that sentence, you should, when we get to the end of our course, we may talk about what does it mean to be left, what does it mean to be right, is there a left wing anymore after October 7th? That sentence is going to resurface, that we see an ebb and flow of what it means to be left wing and right wing. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Either way, the ideology of Begin's government is going to, like I said, overlap in some areas and then diverge in others, which include the fact that socialism, for socialism's sake, as its own entity, isn't what's going to drive us, but we're going to be much more of a capitalistic society, an open economy, and yet still we are built on this idea of all for one and one for all, meaning the concept of the hora, that circle dance, which fits socialist labor Zionism as it evolved, also fits the ongoing conceptions of Israelis of who we are. But change is in the air. And as such, we see our economy is going to have terrible inflation in the 1980s. And we're going to see the devaluation of the lira, which was our original coinage, that turns into the late 70s into the shekel. The shekel itself is going to be devalued, and ultimately it'll be the late 80s that we see the birth of the new shekel by slashing off all the zeros. But that's really as an aside, as our growing pains into what we will discuss later in our session today, the startup nation will pretty much be born in this decade. But in your screen, you see something called the First Intifada. And with all of that, we're reminded that I could have ended the conversation if we're talking about perhaps, I don't know, a normal country dealing with economy and dealing with inflation and dealing with change of government. But we also have this issue with the Palestinians. And for those Palestinians who since 1967 had been under Israeli control, I'll put once again in parentheses that in the aftermath of 1967, there was a question, should we take all of those Palestinians, about 2.5 million who were in the West Bank at the time, and about 1.2 million at the time who were in the Gaza Strip? Should we make them all Israeli citizens? Now, for the most part, I would say that it was a pretty quick decision not to make them all Israeli citizens for two main reasons. One is it was not clear what was going to continue to happen with the Gaza Strip and with the West Bank. Two, a decision was made to offer citizenship for those who wanted, who lived in East Jerusalem because of the unique nature, the unification of the city of Jerusalem. But if citizenship were to be given to all of the Palestinians who were living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, well, that would essentially put 50% Palestinian Israelis and 50% Jewish Israelis, one against the other, and in a democratic society, that wouldn't sustain itself. But for the most part, there was no interest in those Palestinians to automatically become Israeli citizens. So we have an interesting process going on, one that everybody seems to get into a groove, that it seems okay. They're not exactly citizens. They do have freedom of movement. They can come and they can work in Israel freely, and we'll shop in Ramallah and in Khan Yunis. And everybody will be happy and we'll maintain ourselves. And we saw to a certain degree, we were able to maintain ourselves in the 1970s as we became a nation amongst the world, even when still dealing with ongoing terrorism at the hands of the PLO, whether outside of Israel or from Lebanon into Israel. But the bottom line is that not all was as quiet as it seemed. And in December of 1987, there was going to be a traffic accident near the Palestinian refugee camp of Jabalia in Gaza, in which an Israeli Jewish truck driver would hit another car with several Palestinian casualties. This was as if a tinderbox exploded. And what you begin to see from December of 1987 that will continue more or less up until 1993 is what will be known as the uprising, or literally in Arabic, the Intifada means a shaking off. And of course, it wasn't called the first Intifada until 2000, but we'll get to that as well. And this Intifada was marked by mass demonstrations of Palestinians, starting first in the West Bank, first in the Gaza Strip, and then spreading over to the West Bank. It was made up primarily of these demonstrations that were violent with rocks and Molotov cocktails, these petrol bombs. And often you would see the children and the women and then the men in the back, or some kind of configuration of that. For the combat troops that were sent in to quell these demonstrations, I can tell you the majority of them were not trained in this kind of civilian protests or demonstrations or riots for that matter. Meaning when paratroopers were sent into the Gaza Strip to try and quiet these uprisings, there were not the tools given, and yet these rocks were deadly weapons. And terrorism was abound, both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also in Israel proper. Meaning the ongoing terrorism that we saw from 1948 and onward continued past 1967 with this eruption. And in the eruption, there was also going to be a new organization that rose up and was born out of this Intifada to be called Hamas. And Hamas, which was an outcropping of, that I mentioned last time, the Muslim Brotherhood that was in Egypt, which was a Sunni terrorist organization, was going to be grassroots Palestinian, Sunni, starting in the Gaza Strip, spreading to the West Bank. It was going to replace the leadership of the PLO that was ousted from Lebanon to Tunisia. And very soon would be funded by Iran as another proxy army that was created by Iran, or at least supported by Iran, as part of its maneuvering to create a circle of fire around Israel, which it deemed, since 1979, the little Satan compared to the big Satan, which was the United States. The first of the proxy armies, by the way, that was created by Iran would be Hezbollah. But we're going to come back to all of that when we really get into, especially in the last two sessions, of what's been happening in the north. This first intifada, however, really sent Israel, it sent us for a loop, so to speak, in that we didn't know how to deal with it. And Yitzhak Rabin, who, if you remember, I talked about last session, had stepped down from his premiership, came back into the government as the Minister of Defense, and was the Minister of Defense in the first intifada. And to the extent that, well, doing our best, he would say, not to use lethal fire, he was willing to break the bones of Palestinians to ensure that no more Molotov cocktails or rocks on cars or anything that could be lethal could be used. So there was a real challenge of how to deal with this first intifada. It would, for the most part, considered ended in 1993, and we'll get to that as we now enter into the 1990s. During the 1990s, you can see on this bulletin board several major moments in the annals of the history of Israel that will really, in many ways, provide for us the trajectory that we would see continue all the way through the 2000s. And you can see these various images here on the bulletin board. Let's just maybe break it down a little bit. In the 1990s, you remember, of course, that in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, all of those who had been considered refuseniks were now free to go. And the truth is that for those Jews who had wanted to leave the Soviet Union, actually started leaving when about, I don't know, something like 200,000 visas were given to Jews to leave the former Soviet Union between 1970 and 1991. Of those 200,000 visas that were given to Jews, about 165,000 made their way to the state of Israel. But there were many more, thousands and thousands of Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union who weren't allowed. And I'm sure many of you remember wearing the bracelets for the former prisoners of Zion, those refuseniks, as I mentioned. But in 1990, we begin to see these mass waves of immigration of Jews to the state of Israel. And between 1990 and 2000, roughly 1 million Jews will immigrate to the state of Israel. Now, these Jews who make Aliyah, let's maybe be a little bit more accurate in my definition. All of those who arrive will be recognized as those who should be receiving Israeli citizenship under what is called the law of return. And the law of return was a law that was designated back in its earliest days of a state to identify any Jew, or rather, any person who had at least one Jewish grandparent to be allowed to become a citizen of the state of Israel. As you know, Israel doesn't have a separation of religion and state. And the identification of a Jew is under the auspices of Orthodox Jewry, i.e., Jewish law, halakha. Nothing like distracting me, Rabbi. Thank you, with my name there. Jewish law, halakha, which stipulates that a Jew is recognized as one with a Jewish mother. Now, again, we can argue this. We can talk about the evolution of Jewish law over time. That's not for our purpose right now. But Israel recognized that sometimes there could be someone who is living as a Christian, but whose grandparent, one of them, was Jewish. And if it was good enough for the Nazis to identify who a Jew was, it was good enough for the state of Israel. And therefore, there's some question as to whether the entire million were in fact Jewish, recognized by Jewish law. 20% maybe not, but that's inconsequential because 1 million were recognized as citizens of the state. Now, as wonderful as this is, and at a time where this million essentially became 25% of the population of the state of Israel, as wonderful as this is, there was also challenges when you change your demographics overnight, over a decade. And there was discrimination with these waves of immigration. And there was not a complete acceptance of everything that these Jews had achieved in the former Soviet Union to easily be translated to modern Israeli Western life that we had here in Israel. For example, doctors came over more times than not, were not able to transfer over their degrees and served as nurses or orderlies. Scientists, professors, sometimes found themselves only teaching elementary school, or maybe a high school chemistry class, or maybe not even. So that there was real societal challenges, which, by the way, was not different from any wave of immigration. In fact, every wave of immigration that came to the state of Israel, from its inception, I can say, honestly and openly, that every mistake was made. And yet, Israel always turned to its brothers and sisters who were under duress and said, brothers and sisters, come. We don't know what we're going to do with you, but we'll figure it out when you get here. And there's challenges when these kind of things happen, whether it's back in the 50s with the Ma'abarot that we discussed, whether it's with Ethiopian Jewry that we already mentioned and will continue to, and with Jews from the former Soviet Union. And the truth is that our society became better, both because of those Ethiopian Jews who became Israeli citizens and the continued diversity it added to our society, and of course, the elevated level of education and culture that these Jews from the former Soviet Union brought with them. But it would take a while for all that to play out. And the sad reality is that one of the turning points for Israelis of former Soviet Union descent to really begin to be recognized as part of the Israeli cauldron, or I should say salad, because it took us a while to move away from a melting pot, to recognize that the hyphen that you guys invented back in the 70s was something that we should embrace. In many ways, actually, it was Leah Goldberg in her poem that first shared that with when she came of her own maturity, recognizing the ability to understand that we have roots in different places. But sadly, it was in 2001, on June 1st, that there was a terrorist explosion that took place at a discotheque in Tel Aviv called the Dolphinarium that had been essentially become a safe haven, as it were, a disco club for kids, meaning especially for teens, for those who came from the former Soviet Union. And suicide bombers got in line and blew themselves up with terrible, terrible outcome. But this inclusion into Israeli society through this baptism by fire, in many ways, I think awoke many Israelis to the recognition that, well, they're just like us. Now, in 1991, actually, if we go back to 1990, you, of course, remember the very close ally of the United States, Kuwait, that was under attack by Saddam Hussein. Of course, very close ally is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. We know that there aren't a lot of friends, but mostly interests. And America begins to create, it was Bush Sr. who creates a coalition of what they would have identified then as moderate Sunni Arab states that would join together in a regional push against Iraq. This Desert Shield would turn into Desert Storm in January of 1991, and is the first aerial bombardments of Kuwait by the coalition began, rockets in response didn't land amongst American troops, but they landed in Israel. And on January 17th, the first of what would be 42 Scud missiles were fired somewhat indiscriminately at Israel. And it was at a time where we didn't have the very pinpoint exact sirens that we have today. After the first couple of strikes, Israel would get a few minutes warning with sirens throughout the country, not knowing where things would fall. And of course, there was no missile defense system that could intercept any of these Scud rockets. Fortunately, we received a whole battery or several batteries of the Patriot missiles that were American, with American troops that came over. And Israelis would come out with literally chicken soup or kube, or depending on what your old country was. And they would bring them food and set up this wonderful embrace to these Americans who had come over to defend us. Now, part of the agreement by Bush's government to give us the Patriots was, of course, shared values and a real promise of defending, but also because Yitzhak Shamir, the prime minister of Israel at the time, who had been a hawk of hawks, he was right wing of Menachem Begin. He was the one who broke away from the Etzel when the Etzel went back into the fold of the Haganah, when David Ben-Gurion said, "We'll fight Hitler as if there's no white paper and fight the what you remember." And he starts the Lehi. Either way, it was clear to those of us who were in combat that it was only a matter of moments once the first rockets fell that we'd be in Iraq. I was literally on the tarmac, ready to be dropped in Iraq when the call came to stand down. At the time, we thought, this is what we fought for, not because this is what we trained for, not for fighting and running after 12-year-old kids in Gaza in the first Intifada, but this was going to be our drop, combat deployment in Iraq. In the end, there was enough pressure by Bush on Shamir not to get involved so he could hold the coalition of these so-called Sunni moderate states, that Israel backed down and didn't protect itself even though it was hit. So there is some challenge there. But the picture you see, it's not my family, but this is how we were told to defend ourselves. We were given gas masks. We were told to go into our safe room. And our safe room is not the safe room of today. The safe room was, let's buy a whole bunch of plastic nylon and duct tape and seal the windows, because what Saddam Hussein is most likely going to fire over is going to be unconventional warfare. So chemical, gas, etc. What was so bizarre is that I was serving in Lebanon at the time, I would call home to see if my family was okay. That was the absurdity of it all. During this war, which lasted about a month here in Israel, until February 23rd or so, a little bit more than a month, there were 2 casualties from direct hits that fell in, people were killed by these incoming rockets, but there were several dozen who were killed from heart attacks or the insulin that we were given, the atropine that we were given against the, if it was a chemical attack. In the end, by the way, there was no chemicals. It was all conventional warfare. So all of this is going on, and that war comes to an end, but it seems to open up other opportunities during that reality of the post-Gulf War reality, and that there's a lot of movement happening. And of that movement, we see that there's going to now be another major wave of immigration by Ethiopians. Now, this Operation Solomon, as it's going to be called, is going to be an event that begins really in the aftermath of Operation Moses coming to an end, recognizing how many more Ethiopian Jews were still in peril. The government of Mengistu Haile Mariam, who was a dictator from the 1970s, part of his government essentially overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie, who was very much beloved in Ethiopia, but turned Ethiopia into a dictatorship. So there's famine, there's civil war, there's still anti-Semitism, there's a government that's falling down, and honestly, Mengistu Haile Mariam is looking to get out of Dodge. So for millions of dollars changing hands and a promise to bring him to safety, Israel is allowed to take over the airport in Addis Ababa for 36 hours. Months leading up to this moment, Mossad agents go to the Ethiopian highlands, mostly in the region of what's known as Gondar, where the majority of Jewish tribes were living, and they begin to motivate them and move them to Addis Ababa, to the capital. And then between May 24th and 25th, there will be 35 aircraft, with one of those aircraft, by the way, breaking the world record, an LL-747 with all the seats taken out, with 1,088 people on board and with 2 berths on that flight. But more than 14,000 Jews would fly to Israel, and when they landed, they became Israeli citizens. That is part of the reason for the existence of the state of Israel. And as I said last time, brothers and sisters, this is your home. But with Israel changing its demographics overnight, we also see continued discrimination, even racism. And again, I'm not saying that to disparage our country, but I do want to put front and forward that we're also just a regular country, like any other Western country. I know you know a country or two that has hundreds of years of demographic change, and still there's racism. And yet there's improvement. And that's important to remember as well. What else is happening? Now, I'm doing this a little bit, we're going to jump back and forth a bit on a few things, but one of them is definitely going to be the Oslo Accords. Now, these Oslo Accords, and you can see Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat, with Bill Clinton physically pulling them together. Some of you may even remember where you were on the White House when you saw this on the White House lawn back in 1993. This was quite a momentous occasion. There's no question. When I say a momentous occasion, I'm talking about a watershed moment. And this watershed moment started with Yitzhak Rabin taking over the Labor Party and being elected as the prime minister because the Labor Party won the most amount of votes in the elections of 1992. And he puts in motion a process that will evolve into what you see right now on the screen, that will change the trajectory of Israel forever. As he will say at the event that happens in 1994, when he receives, along with Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat himself, the arch-terrorist that he was, the Nobel Peace Prize, he says, as long as I thought that there was no other choice, I was a soldier in all of Israel's wars. And now I am a soldier for peace. And I will do whatever I need to do, I'm paraphrasing now, so that our children will have a different future. Now, it sounds wonderful, and it is wonderful. And yet it doesn't happen in a laboratory. It's not happening in a bubble. But the concept at least, said we're going to have a process of mutual recognition. Israel will recognize Yasser Arafat as the chairman of what will be called the Palestinian Authority, which will be a framework that over the course of 5-6 years will have various stages, and those stages, if each one is met, will ultimately reach fruition with the establishment of a Palestinian state within much of the area of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As you can see on the screen, the map that you see was the layout of this Oslo Accords. And the areas that you see yellow, was to be known as Areas A. Areas A, in which the Palestinians would have complete control, militarily and civilly, on themselves. Areas B, which was the mustard color that you see there, orange color that you see there, was to be areas in which Israel was in charge of security and the Palestinians would be in charge of their civil matters. And Area C, the blue area, would be areas in which Israel retained complete control over security and civil matters. Most of this division had to do with demographics. Where was the majority of Palestinians located? What were the six major cities of the Palestinians? Where were their Jewish settlements? And also, what were the security considerations? Most significantly, the Jordan Valley. Israel said, we are going to retain control over that segment of the West Bank, that's the Jordan Valley, so that there won't be a situation at some point, God forbid, that, well, Iran, or Iraq for that matter, could reach all the way to the 11-mile segment, which was the thinnest part of the waist of the pre-June 5th, 1967 Israel. So this was a process that we're going to go through. And now, while that happens, and that's the first step in what was going to be a momentous reality, but we'll talk soon enough about how it wasn't momentous because of the ongoing terror. But within all of that, there seems to be a wave of hopefulness and a vision for a future that is unlike anything we experienced, because so soon after, in 1994, we're going to see in July of 1994, the signing, first of all, of an agreement between King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin, who share a smoke in the White House before the event in July, which was essentially a document saying we are ending our reality of hostilities, one country against the next. We are ending our state of war, which had been the case since 1948. And then in October of 1994, there's going to be an agreement signed, which is a bona fide peace agreement between the Jordanians and Israel in the Arava Valley, just north of Eilat, right in the middle between Israel and Jordan, in what would be called the Arava Crossing. And at that Arava Crossing were, excuse me, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Jordan, King Hussein, Ezer Weitzman, who was the President of Israel, Bill Clinton, Warren Christopher. This was a momentous occasion. If I go back for just a moment, the relationship between Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein, even though these two old war dogs had spent their entire adult lives fighting each other, there was a mutual respect between them. And this mutual respect almost allowed the state of war to dissolve so naturally and for peace to be signed so naturally that it was quite the antithesis of the peace agreement that we signed with Egypt. And from the assassination of Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, we had a very cold peace with Egypt. We still have peace with Egypt, but it was always much more of a cold peace, whereas this was much more natural. And in fact, the shaking of hands by Israeli troops that you see here on the right with Jordanian troops was very heartfelt. Now, all of this is the backdrop to, well, a song that's written. And the song that's written is written in 1994. And it's written in 94 specifically to be sung by one of our entertainment troops. And this particular entertainment troupe was part of the Education Corps. Many of our top-tiered singers from the 60s and onward were those who grew up in the entertainment corps as musicians of some kind. The reason I'm telling you all this is because what we're going to hear in just a moment is a song that was almost a response. It was a It was almost as if it was the second part of a dialogue with another song that was written 20 years earlier. And you remember last session, we spoke about the song that was written in the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War called The Last War, HaMilchama HaAchrona, when those who fought truly, honestly believed that that would be the last war. And now we're going to have soldiers. Now, they themselves weren't combat soldiers, but they're representing and reflecting a generation that was born in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. And I'll just ask you, as you're reading the lyrics and you're hearing the song, what do you think the theme was? What were they trying to convey?
אנחנו הילדים של חורף, שנת 73. חלמתם אותנו לראשונה עם שחר, בתום הקרבות. ראיתם דברים עייפים שבאו למזלם הטוב. ראיתם נשים צעקות ורציתם כל כך לאהוב, וכשהראיתם בחורף 73 שחיסרה המלחמה.
So it really is a beautiful song, a powerful song, and actually has been recreated in the aftermath of the October 7th war. But again, we'll get to that and hear about the lyrics, those lyrics later down the road. But as you see here, on the one hand, it almost sounds that it's a challenge. Mom and Dad, you promised us no more wars. You taught us not to lie. But wait a second. We get it. We know that you meant it. And don't worry, we got this. It's our turn now. Now, on the one hand, these kids are saying this because, in fact, they were wearing helmets and they had their guns and it was their call to duty. But at the same time, these soldiers are living through this reality of the Oslo Accords and the peace with Jordan, and who knows what the opportunities down the road could bring. Maybe they'd be the last ones to have to wear the uniform. And then they make it very clear, though. Just so everyone knows we're on the same page, Mom and Dad, but we don't want to be here. We also have dreams. We also want to get married and have children. But for now, this is on us. Now, I can tell you that this was written 2 years after I got out of the Army. And it, to a T, reflected where I was. And I can tell you that 30 years later, with my own daughters going in, they absolutely knew and felt from within that it was their turn now to defend. And they absolutely didn't want to be there and would rather be like with their American friends. But they knew it's their turn. So on the one hand, this is a very prideful and proud song and empowering, and also of the saddest songs that I know have ever been written. And yet this is the reality. And speaking of reality, and perhaps the shattering of dreams, in the period of time leading up to November 4th, 1995, this process of peace, while on paper seemed ideal, as I mentioned, we are not seeing this process unfold within a vacuum or within a laboratory of if we mix a little bit of this and a little bit of that, it doesn't work, then I'll step out, I'll change my little hat and white coat and gloves and try something else. The problem with this process is if it doesn't work, buses start blowing up and cafes start blowing up and rockets start landing. Now, just so I'm clear, it's not as if there was one camp in Israel that wanted peace and another camp in Israel that didn't want peace. But throughout this process, there were buses blowing up. And this experience informed the totality of Israelis. And interesting enough, that same experience seemed to inform us differently, as there was about 50% who said, Yitzhak Rabin, you are a hero of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And if you are willing to shake hands with that terrorist with blood on his hands, then who are we not to try and imagine a different future for ourselves? And we're with you. And there were 50% that said, how can we trust those terrorists no matter how much we respect you, Rabin? This was that dichotomy. And there were terrible, violent demonstrations in the streets. Demonstrations in which there were those who would hold up posters with Rabin as in a Nazi uniform, or with Arafat's kafia. Some of the figures that we have in our politics today were at those demonstrations. But we found a Israeli society that was on the brink of implosion, even when we were the recipients of too many explosions. And then on November 4th, 1995, Saturday night, Shabbat has come out, this square that you're looking at, which is then called Kings of Israel Square, which is situated right in front of, we're looking as if behind us is the Tel Aviv City Hall. And it was known as a square where the most rambunctious protests took place. It was here that people jumped into the fountains when Maccabi Tel Aviv won the European Basketball Cup. It was here when Peace Now would have its major demonstrations in the First Lebanon War. And it was here that people gathered in a rally in support of Yitzhak Rabin and in support of Shimon Peres, who at the time was the Minister of Defense. Sorry, the Foreign Minister, who was moving towards this agreement, no matter how many buses kept blowing up and how many Israelis were being killed. The headline here, by the way, was the headline after November 4th, 1995, meaning Sunday, November 5th, 1995. And you can see Yitzhak Rabin here as part of the entourage that was there at the rally. There were politicians, there were celebrities, there were musicians who were 2 generations younger than Rabin, who were there recognizing that here's this grandfather, politician, who's looking out for me. And he's singing a song called Shir L'Shalom, a song for peace. And you also see the image of someone we'll mention in just a moment, Yigal Amir, who was the assassin who murdered Rabin, when you can see him fall here on the ground. But this is the square. And in a moment, as we have to imagine that it looked like that. That's what it looked like on the eve of this rally. And up on this is what Rabin saw and the entourage saw from the podium, which was up here above on the other side of the fountain over there. And that's, of course, Rabin singing Shir L'Shalom. Now that's City Hall. And in a moment, now these stairs are the stairs, just a second. These are the stairs that are in the back of the stage area and off to the left that would take the entourage down towards where all the cars were waiting. So they're coming down the stairs here. And as they come down, That's Ibn Gabriel. Oh, sorry. That was Ibn Gabriel Street. And each of these different plates on the ground that you can see are where different individuals were standing, including Yitzhak Rabin right over here, the bodyguard and the assassin. Meaning this is where gives people a sense of where things are. And I'll just show you that right over where these guys are sitting, at the time, this area over here that you can see wasn't closed off pedestrian area. It was an alley. And all the cars of the excuse me, of the politicians, etc., were parked there. The area was roped off. You saw the street to the other side. It was all closed off. It was supposedly a sterile area. And on this, where this bench is, there was like an urban planter. And there were different drivers lolling around, and security had checked their credentials. And there was a young guy by the name of Yigal Amir, who was a 20-nothing-year-old law student from Bar Ilan University, who said, no, it's okay, I'm one of the drivers, and nobody checked his credentials. And then at a certain point, he's going to get up and then walk over. He's going to walk over pretty much where the screen is right now. And as first Shimon Peres comes down the stairs, and everything's closed off, so he's waving, he's smiling. You can imagine after all the challenges that going through, this was a moment of elation. His car pulls up, he gets in, and he drives off. Then Leah Rabin comes down, and then Yitzhak Rabin comes down, and he also stops for a moment and looks out. And as Damti, his driver, begins to move forward, Yigal Amir is going to come around and walk up behind him and shoot 3 times. By the second shot, Reuben, who is the bodyguard, jumps between the shooter and Rabin. He gets shot himself. Rabin crumples to the ground. Reuben, even though he was shot, gets up, throws Rabin into the back seat of Damti's car, and they drive off to the hospital. And then at a certain point, nobody knows anything from anything. But about an hour and a half later, across Israel, you hear a collective gasp because the head of Rabin's office gets in front of the cameras in front of the hospital and says it's with great anguish and pain that the state of Israel mourns the death of Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of the State of Israel. May his memory be for a blessing. And you hear this cry as if the earth itself was being ripped apart. And it's not just figurative, meaning you really heard that. This was a watershed moment. Now, for weeks after, this is the memorial, by the way, that became the official memorial. But for weeks after, you would see people on the bus with tears in their eyes, and you would know why they were crying. I was at university at the time. I would go into class. Nobody would say anything for 50 minutes, and we'd leave. And truthfully, there was a generation of us who had fought, or had lived here, who had fought here, who had traveled. We have to get off the island a bit, who came back. Maybe we were just married or on the way to being married, or we were in university, not yet kids. There was a real moment where many of us said, here are the keys. We're done. This isn't the country we're going to raise our kids in. This flag no longer represents what we thought it represented. And then we took a deep breath. And we said, maybe this country can mean something again. What you're looking at now are the children of those kids who continued for decades to come back on November 4th and around for these memorial moments. And I think in many ways, it was that need to prove that this isn't us that caused us to stay. Either way, this ripped us apart. And there seemed to be a reconciliation of sorts. And Shimon Peres, who takes over in the aftermath of this assassination as the interim prime minister, will actually go to elections in spring of 1996. And it seems as if the Labour Party is going to be a shoo-in. And yet, in the months and then the weeks and the days leading up to election, suicide bombing after suicide bombing after suicide bombing. And there was a real fear within Israeli society that tipped the hand, that identified that perhaps Shimon Peres and the Labour Party wouldn't be the ones who would best deal with the triage that's needed now, and therefore the Likud Party came into power, at the helm of which was Benjamin Netanyahu. And he will be prime minister for the next 3 years. We have a 4-year term. But because of our particular style of parliamentary democracy, which I don't think we're going to get to today, but next session for sure, we'll talk about how that works, obviously adding to what you already know. We see a pendulum swinging back and forth within Israeli society. From the Labour Party up until 1977, being replaced by the Likud Party. And then into the 1980s, when we're split down the middle and we actually have a national unity party, government, with Shimon Peres being prime minister for the first 2 years and Yitzhak Shamir being prime minister for the second 2 years. And then the Labour Party takes over in 1992. We spoke about that. And then in 1996, the Likud Party. And then in 1999, the Labour Party again. And then in 2001, the Likud Party. So we have this pendulum, which isn't just a backward country from some third world that, of course, this is how we are. I think we have to recognize the very abnormal reality that Israel is dealing with and the pressure cooker that's generating this pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. So what else is happening in the 1990s? Within all of this, we just want to be a normal country. And what's a reflection of that normal country? Once again, Israel wins the Eurovision contest. And we win with a singer who goes by the name of Dana International. Her name was Sharon Cohen, and she wins in 1998. Now, in a moment, we'll hear the song, and you can see and hear what she sings about. And actually, at a certain point, most of the Eurovision songs are going to be in English. She's originally from a Yemenite family, born in 1969, but she was born Yaron Cohen, meaning from a very early age, she identified as female. Now, of course, okay, fine, she's a she, that's fine, we get it, of course. But yet, often when one thinks of Israel, one doesn't automatically imagine that a transgender singer would not only win the Eurovision, okay, but would represent the state of Israel. So this too is part of what Israel is within all of this. Like I said, you gotta love bell bottoms and sparkle.
Ori, it's hard for us to hear. It's possible you're not sharing the sound.
Okay. I mean, the words are right there on the screen. So you know what? Let me stop the share for a second, and I'll click the thing so it'll make it easier. This was actually in Hebrew. She stuck to her Hebrew, even though everybody else was singing mostly in English. She continues in Hebrew as well. Hold on. I'm just going to stop share for a moment. Just 1 second. Let's see if I do this. Share, click, mute, and okay.
יש קסמים ויש ימים קשים, ומה שהיא כולה שלה, ואנחנו איתי באימפריה, על הבמה איתי בהיסטריה, היא כולה שיר אהבה.
So again, is there anything that's Jewish here? Is there anything that's Israeli here? Maybe not. Maybe this could be any country at all. And yet, maybe it's a reflection of who she is. And maybe it's a reflection of who we hope to be. And maybe it's a reflection of, again, grabbing the bull by the horns. We want to be a nation amongst all the nations. So all of this is happening simultaneously. And so is this. In 2000, in May of 2000, what began as the operation for the peace of Galilee that turned into the Lebanon War, that would ultimately turn into the First Lebanon War, that started with the conquest of Lebanon for all of the reasons that we know happened, meaning Israel wasn't looking to colonize Lebanon, but actually to deal with a terrorist problem that Lebanon wasn't dealing with. Sound familiar? Nothing seems to have changed, if maybe the organization. And at a certain point in 1985, Israel pulls back to what becomes known as the Southern Lebanese Security Zone that you can see on the map here. Again, it's in Hebrew, but you see the lines. The purple line that you see there was the international border between Israel and Lebanon, and the red line was between the purple and the red was the Southern Lebanese Security Zone, where Israel allied with the Christians, Arabs who were living in southern Lebanon, who had absolutely no love lost between them and the Shiite Hezbollah that had taken over southern Lebanon and were using it as a staging ground for attacks against Israel. Now, what you can see are the images of those soldiers leaving there in May. Now, interesting enough, the prime minister in 2000 was the helm of the Labor Party, and his name was Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak was the prodigy of Yitzhak Rabin. Ehud Barak was also a former chief of staff of the IDF, and in fact, Israel's most decorated soldier, a real bona fide commando, who made a decision: we are strong enough to pull our troops out and not have any more Israeli soldiers die in southern Lebanon. And to date, up until the year 2000, 256 soldiers died in southern Lebanon. But the main propellant to get Ehud Barak to that point were 4 women. And these 4 women were the core of a movement, a grassroots movement that was born out of one of the, if not the worst military tragedy that we've ever had. And in 1997, in the winter, in the early months of 1997, there were 2 transport helicopters that were traveling over the border from Israel into Lebanon, transporting troops in, as often we would do. And it was just south of the border. Those of you who kind of imagine the map of Israel, and you can imagine the finger of the Galilee, the very tip of what's called the Hula Valley, nestled between the Galilee Mountains in the west and the Golan Heights in the east. There's a few kibbutzim there, right on the border. And there's a beautiful nature reserves there, the Banyas River, the Dan River. Right before the border, right in that area, these 2 helicopters collided. And 73 soldiers and pilots and officers died with no survivors. It was a horrific moment. The next day, as the names and the faces started to become clear, it was clear that every face that can be found in Israel every ethnicity that can be found in Israel, and multiple religions that can be found in Israel, all aligned with the title Israeli, were amongst those who were killed. There were Druze, and there were Jews, and there were Christians, and there were Muslims, and there were Jews, there were Arabs. So these four mothers were mothers of children, of soldiers who had been fighting in Lebanon. They weren't necessarily part of that terrible event. But this organization that was called Arba Imahot, four mothers, took to the streets. And at first they were ridiculed by the military brancha and the government, the male-dominated machismo of the government. You women, you don't know, you weren't in combat. You're actually making it worse for our troops. And they said again and again and again, we are strong enough that we can defend our borders from our borders. And the truth is they changed the nation, because ultimately the Labour Party, as I said, replaces the Likud Party in 1999. And what got him elected was this promise that we will pull out of Lebanon. And as the title, the headline of the Yediot Ahronoth paper says, Ima yatzanu mi Lebanon. Mom, we finally left Lebanon. In 2020, Israel finally recognized that experience of 18 years as being part of an elongated war that we were in. And I have to tell you, when this ribbon showed up in my mailbox 20 years after I finished reserve duty, I was surprised by how important this little thing was that recognized that what we did was in fact a war, because that was the outcome. And with all of this happening, oh, by the way, as soon as we pulled out, rockets started falling, meaning that seemed to be an indicator within Israeli society that within Middle East society, that if you release land, it is a sign of weakness. And this was clearly internalized by Hezbollah. And it won't be the last time that the Middle East has that same reaction to Israel withdrawing from certain land. That isn't a left-wing statement or a right-wing statement. It is a fact on the ground. Now, in 2000, Israel's still within a certain bubble coming out of the 1990s. We've started with, well, it seems that there's this incredible waves of tourism that are here. We'll talk about the Startup Nation soon enough, but it's starting to bubble over, and the pockets of the height of the internet, all of this is really creating incredible feeling here in Israel. And in the summer of 2000, the Labour Party, Ehud Barak, is going to be pushing forward with Clinton and Yasser Arafat at a finalization of what started 5 years earlier. Even with all of the ongoing terror, there seemed to be a real drive. Let's just make this happen. And the Camp David II Accords, Camp David II, which is the next incarnation of the negotiations that would take place in Camp David, seem to, well, present the world with two sides. And Clinton was very quick to identify who was responsible for the failure of the Camp David II Accords. And he said very clearly, Yasser Arafat was given 94% of the West Bank to be part of a Palestinian state. And he rejected it. What was the main problem? Because Ehud Barak was even willing to divide Jerusalem. There was a map of the old city, and anyone who's been to the old city knows how convoluted those alleyways are. in which some of the alleyways would be Israel, some of the alleyways would be part of a Palestinian state. It was impossible, and yet it was agreed upon. Israel even allowed for a symbolic return of some of the Palestinians to their homes in Jaffa and Haifa. But what Israel rejected was a mass return, a right of return for Palestinians. Because if that was the case, you would find that it would essentially nullify the existence of the state of Israel. And what's very interesting as a sidebar is to, at least we should understand, as far as the world stage is concerned, the only people in the history of the world, at least modern world, that have been allowed to transfer hereditarily the identifier of refugee to their subsequent generations have been the Palestinians. Meaning in the 1950s, nothing was more synonymous with the word refugee than the word Jew. And by the end of the 1950s, in the early 1960s, that was no longer the case. It was no longer the case because of Jews who went to other countries, but primarily because Israel said, you know what we said? We don't know what we're going to do with you. We know we're going to make every mistake that's possible, but come, we'll figure it out later. And yet the United Nations created specific organizations within whose responsibility, it seemed, was to allow Palestinians to continue to stay in that status of refugee. And this process seemed to explode when Yasser Arafat didn't get everything that he set out to get, when Israel realized that if he did, it would nullify the state of Israel. Now, this is going to lead to the beginning of what would be called the Second Intifada, the second uprising. And the reason I chose this particular image is because it was a much more violent intifada. And it would go from September of 2000 all the way through the end of September 2000, all the way through, well, it's not exactly clear when it ended, 2005, 2006, or 2007, but it would be much more violent. And it would be much more violent. And when I say violent, I'm meaning many more mass suicide bombings, terrorism for terrorism's sake, really just a reality in which there would be, well, every Israeli has in their minds a series of what I would call iconic terrorist attacks. It could be because we happened to be near a bus that blew up, or just had left a cafe that had blown up, or we remember the smell in the air of the glass on the ground. At best, of course, at worst, that we were the recipients or someone we love. And I'm not really a big fan of terrorism tourism, but there's one or two that I think stand out, one of which was the explosions that took place on the suicide bombers that walked in to the Park Hotel in Netanya in 2002 at the end of March during the Seder on Passover Eve. And there were 30, as you can see, who were killed in this terrible attack. This would generate something that would continue to be with us until today, which was the creation of what's called the security barrier. And this security barrier, you can see that on the ground, we have a fence, we have a patrol road, another fence, there's sensors, there's cameras. And you can see over here on the screen that there's a dark red line and there's a light purple line. See that? With some of it's black also and pink. But the light purple line is essentially the green line. And the green line, or that purple line there, runs about 350 kilometers long. The red line that you can see, which is the terrain of the security barrier, which in the early years wasn't completed, but it's pretty much complete, even though there's pockets of it that are still not complete, runs about 640 kilometers. So there's a real discrepancy, even if it follows more or less the contours of the Green Line. And the reasons for that, it has to do primarily with demographic growth of Jewish communities just east of the Green Line, so that it includes within it as much as possible for security purposes. Now, I'm not going to get into a very long-winded explanation beyond what I just shared about the security barrier, but there are those who call it the apartheid wall or the ghetto wall or just the wall. Interesting that that's the language which is chosen when, in fact, of the security barrier, which is the official name for it, about 95% is actually a fence. And only 4 or 5% is wall. Now, it could just be semantics. And yet, for those who do know and use the language of wall, clearly the creation of connotation with other walls is part of the mix. Now, there's a lot of conversation. Is the security barrier necessary? Is it not? Should it be completed? Should it be removed? Is it the establishment of a de facto border between Palestinians and Israelis? Is it an apartheid wall or barrier? Well, again, we can go into a lot of detail, but we do know there's Jews on both sides, there's Muslims on both sides, there's Christians on both sides. We do know there's about 500,000 Israelis who live in settlements in the area of the West Bank / Judean Samaria / occupied territories. And whether or not it should be removed in order to allow freedom of movement into Israel proper for whoever would like, or it should be removed because Israel left its fences back in Europe and we shouldn't be living in a country where we have to be surrounded by fences to be protected, or it should stay in place because Israel owes the Palestinians a state of their own, and this should be the border between Israel and Palestine, and therefore remove all of the Israelis who are living in the West Bank. It's an ongoing conversation that continues even through today. Now, within all of this, we have, again, great highs and painful lows. And here's one event that allows us to see both. And that is the events of January and February of 2003, when Israel will have its first astronaut, Ilan Ramon, Colonel Ilan Ramon, be part of the Columbia shuttle. Remember Ilan Ramon? We met him as the youngest pilot to be part of the F-15 and the F-16 planes that flew to Osirak to blow up the Iraqi nuclear reactor. He will, as a colonel, be chosen. We will see in Ilan Ramon the best of us. And not just because he was a colonel in the Air Force, because he was a mensch. And we got to know him. We got to know him through the interviews, through knowing his family, his wife Rona, his 4 children. He was the best of us. And we have here is a short clip on who he in fact was.
Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli to fly in space.
Here comes the Superman entry of the astronaut from Israel. They took several special things. First of all, the Israeli flag, the Israeli Declaration of Independence.
The unmistakable signs of a vehicle breaking up.
The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity.
מזווית המבט שלנו כאן בחלל, כשאנו סובבים במסלול סביב כדור הארץ, אנו מביטים אליכם ולמולנו נשקף עולם ללא גבולות, מלא שלווה והדר. תפילה בליבנו שהאנושות כולה כאחד תדמיין את העולם כפי שנשקף לנו, ללא גבולות, ותשאף לחיות ביחד בשלום.
Colonel Husband, who was the commander of the mission, and of course the rest of the entire team, including Ilan Ramon, all died on re-entry, as you remember, as the shuttle disintegrated over Texas. His wife Rona and their children came back to Israel, and his son, one of his sons, Asaf, followed in his father's footsteps and became a pilot, and like his father, was also the outstanding cadet in the course. And painfully, very painfully and sadly, in a training accident, Asaf was killed. And later, Rona also passed away from cancer. But the family was very much an integral part of who we were as the state. We felt that he really reflected the best of us, because this idea of space exploration as part of our mandate, with everything else we have going on, once again, to be a nation amongst the nations for the betterment of humanity. His job, by the way, on the shuttle was as a payload specialist to test the dust particles over the Sahara Desert, to better understand drought for the betterment of humanity. Jumping ahead to 2019 for a moment, that dream of reaching space didn't subside. And there was, you may remember, there was a competition put out by Google X. The idea was to create non-government or government, not alone, not just government organizations and institutions, to generate a lunar landing. And at a certain point, all the other teams backed out. And Israel continued by creating what was a 150 kilogram, maybe the size of a washing machine, lunar lander, and was able to get this close to the moon. And you can see the machine even took the device, the lander, even took a selfie, and right over the moon. It was painful when so close, some of the gyroscopes failed and the probe crashed onto the moon. But again, with everything else going on, Israel continues to do what it can to be a part of the reality that we are part of the world. In 2020 or 21, again, in collaboration with European space agencies, you might recognize, those of you who did a little bit of hiking in our Negev, the Ramon crater over here seems to fit the bill of being a very close replica of Mars. So certain rovers and gear was tested here in the Ramon crater. Now, I'm going to leave you with one last moment that, to a certain degree, closes out the Second Intifada. Not exactly, but largely. And that is, you remember I mentioned that Ehud Barak's Labor government only lasts 2 years. And in 2001, because of the Second Intifada, the Likud party will come to power again, and this time at the helm will be Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon was the mythical general. In 48, 67, 73, was called out of retirement to come back in and to help save Israel. Later, he's the Minister of Defense. You remember when we entered Lebanon. Either way, he becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. And interesting enough, in 2005, at the helm of the state of Israel, will make a decision that will shock and rock Israel. For all of those constituents who voted for Ariel Sharon and the Likud party because of Ariel Sharon, they were completely torn and dissuaded and shocked that Ariel Sharon would choose to disengage from Gaza. And those who voted against them could not believe their eyes. What does it mean to disengage from Gaza? Because of the ongoing intifada, in which 1,000 Israelis would be killed. At the time, the only wars that Israel had that had more casualties was the War of Independence and the Yom Kippur War, up until this point. 1,000 Israelis killed. There were about 3,500 Palestinians who were killed. This was the reality. And Ariel Sharon says, okay, let's hand over Gaza to the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat had died a year earlier. Now Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen was in charge of the Palestinian, the PA. And the PA says, no, we're not going to enter into negotiations while the Intifada is going on. And that's when a unilateral decision to disengage happens by Ariel Sharon. And what does that mean? It means that the 7,500 Israelis who are living in the Gaza Strip since post-1967 on 21, 22 different settlements or Jewish communities have to be removed. And we see Israeli soldiers going in August of 2005 and physically removing these Israeli citizens. You remember the image we saw when we disengaged from Sinai. Remember, Land for Peace. We had to physically remove ourselves from the Sinai, and Israeli soldiers had to go into those buildings in Yamit and pull us out. The same thing was happening here, with major civil disobedience happening, with people locking arms within synagogues, and 18 and 19 and 20-year-old soldiers who had to rip them apart from each other. It was a terrible, terrible time, in which by August 22nd, we remove all of the Israeli citizens and then begin a procedure of demolishing the houses that we built in these settlements, but handing over all of the agricultural infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. All of the greenhouses and the water lines and the pipes and the ingenuity was all handed as is to the Palestinians, just waiting to create some kind of industry. Within moments, all of the greenhouses and everything were destroyed. And subsequently, we will see that the pipes and the irrigation pipes will be used in the creation of rockets and missiles. Now, soon enough, we're going to come back to this screen, and I see that this is the perfect time to wind things down. But 2005 was a critical moment. It was critical politically. How could Ariel Sharon, the Hawk of Hawks, do what he did? Is it in fact true that in Hebrew we say, Ma sheroim mikan, lo roim misham? What we see from here, you don't see from there. And the burden of premiership was such that changed something in Ariel Sharon's mind, that in fact, perhaps we need to create a reality that's different than what was and give the Palestinians a place where they can be sovereign over themselves without Israeli involvement. Or, as others might have suggested, that all we saw here play out was another example of the brilliant strategic tactician that Ariel Sharon always was. And he knew sometimes you have to give up the hill to win the war. And in this case, was Ariel Sharon looking at the broader picture, playing the long game, and saying for 7,500 Israelis, okay, it's terrible, but the world will see, we tried. The Palestinians are going to destroy themselves and in the process try and kill us, which will be perfect for us because then we won't have to move an inch from the West Bank, occupied territory / Judea and Samaria. So this outcome, well, we'll talk about it, of course, but shortly after, we will see in the aftermath of Israel's removal, the PA will in fact take over the Palestinian Authority. There will be elections in 2006. these elections, the world will say, let the Palestinians in Gaza have their elections. It's a democratic process. Israel was one of a few in the world that said there's not going to be anything democratic about what happens in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, Hamas wins those elections. And over the course of the next several months, we begin to see a purge at the hands of Hamas against the any PA remnants, meaning any government officials that had been connected to the Palestinian Authority that was headquartered in Ramallah in the West Bank. When I say purge, that's not hyperbole. We're talking about public executions. We're talking about being thrown from rooftops. We're talking about being dragged in the streets by wire. Remember, this is Palestinian against Palestinian. So there's no love lost between Hamas and the PA. And then through this violent takeover, will solidify its rule from 2006, 2007, of course, until today. That's where we are. And that will bring us to a good starting point. So what's going to happen now between 2006 and where we get to in 2023, October 7th, that we will do in our next session.
Wow. Thank you, Uri. We're getting, I think so many people are starting to feel it too. Like, you know, you need the background and the context for understanding everything today, but you can tell also that we're starting to get, you know, now that you talked about what happened in Gaza, it's like it's starting to become very applicable and very real. Everything was, and everything is, to be sure, but it's starting to get very real in terms of understanding where we are now relative to where we were, considering all of our history, how we've gotten to where we are now. So thank you so very much. And Laila Tov, because I'm aware that it is for you currently 1:30 in the morning, but for us, we are just going to go have dinner. But I will say one more thing before I forget, and this was just a message that I was texting with one of the other participants on the screen. We just listening to the various different battles and wars and incursions and moments to defending our country. You're a veteran in the army, and we owe you and your daughters and all Israelis such a debt of gratitude for how you have defended our country that is ours too, to make it a place for Jews. But you have been the one who has put yourself and your family, on the front lines. And so we're so grateful to you for what you've meant to us.
Well, I appreciate that. I do appreciate that. And I can acknowledge that. And I just want to dissect for a moment the last thing that you said about putting myself and my family on the front line. What I'm hearing, and I choose to hear this, is you're referring specifically to my daughters who chose to be in the units that they're in.
Yes.
But not what I wouldn't want to be understood by that is that Israelis will willfully and willingly use their families as fodder on a front line for anything.
No.
Meaning that's not where Israelis are at. Israelis, Trumpeldor, Joseph Trumpeldor, when he was fighting there in Kfar Giladi in 1921, was said to have said, Tov lamut ba'ad artzenu. It is good to die for our country. And truthfully, generations of Israelis have grown up on that. And perhaps we have no choice but to accept that we have that within us, that we have no choice but to anticipate that we will die for our country. And, there's more than one Israeli poet who has talked about the fact that we may have been born with a knife in our hearts as we transfer that from generation to generation, from the days of the binding of Isaac itself. But I would go toe to toe with anyone who would argue, which, by the way, he never actually said that, but who would argue that Israelis feel that that statement is one that we are proud of. Nobody wants to die for anything.
That's a good point.
I think what we can be grateful for Israelis, and in that same line, those who are not Israelis, who care about Israel as well, who are willing to live for Israel, not die for Israel. But having said that, I'll just finish, Sarit, just 1 second. Let me finish the sentence. As we heard in the song earlier, that we are the children of the winter of 73, that here is a generation of young people who recognize that this is a place worth living for, and therefore worth fighting. So I appreciate the accolades, and I'll take them on behalf of generations of other Israelis. But I also recognize that there are also plenty of people who don't live here, who also live for Israel and do what they can. So, okay, so we all have a geographic space that is our particular area. But thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
All right, Laila Tov, Uri, and thank you, everyone. And our next session is on Sunday morning. So we'll see everyone back here on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock our time, but that's 5 o'clock Uri's time.
Yeah, great.
All right, best wishes.